Today, we're going to talk about courage, why you need it, how to cultivate it, and most importantly, what courage requires from us. And to get into the topic, my guest today is Steve Magness. He is an author, a whistleblower, a performance coach, and he's written 3 books that you might have seen, from Peak Performance and Do Hard Things to his most recent book, which is Win the Inside Game. And we are just going to jump into it. Steve, my first question is that in 2012, you blew the whistle on doping at the Nike training camp for runners, and I want you to tell me about what that was and why you did it.
Yeah, I'll set the stage. It was my first real job out of graduate school, and I thought I had obtained my dream job at the age of, 24, and instead it turned out to be a nightmare. Because what happened is I was working with the best of the best, the people who were going to the Olympics and who actually medaled at the Olympics. And I was working with legends in the sport that I loved running. But over time, what I kept seeing is things that just didn't add up, that didn't make sense. I'd come across documents from, the Nike Sports Science Lab that said, and I quote, presently on testosterone for an athlete. And those things jumped out to me. And then I was put in these situations where essentially I was a pretty dang good runner, but not, Olympic level, but I was still in good shape. And I became a guinea pig for testing some things that I thought were questionable at the time, and was assured everything was right, okay, but I didn't do my due diligence like I maybe should have. And long story short, after a little less than a year and a half there, I left, and then my conscience kind of kicked in, and I said, like, hey, I've got to do something about this, tell someone about this, because like it's not right. Like, this is track and field. This isn't the professional sport of all professional sports. And we're seeing, what I thought were rule violations. So I wrote an email to US anti-doping and said, like, here's what I know. Here's what are my thoughts. I don't know. You tell me. And they came back, and that started basically a 10-year journey almost, where I had to go through depositions and hand over my computer and phone and, visit the FBI and all this crazy stuff. And the end result was the coach and the doctor of the program at Nike got banned for anti-doping violations.
All right. Well, so this is crazy so just to back up to your high school life, you were a pretty fast dude. You were the 8th fastest high school kid in America, running just above a 4-minute mile, which is crazy because I can easily do that on my bike. But come on, that is insane. And then you get this, you're going to sports science, you become someone who is trying to make runners better because you're a pretty good runner. And then you become a guinea pig for doping. All right. So what is it like to test? I mean, I'm guessing here that they are testing things on you before it could possibly go prime time. And what were they testing on you?
Yeah, that's what it was. So what they tested on me is this substance called L-carnitine, which is it's a basic amino acid. It's not illegal, anything like that. But the problem is, as a supplement, if you just take it, it takes a really freaking long time to work, if it works at all. But what some researchers had found is that, like, if you just inject the substance, it probably works pretty quickly, and more so. So they wanted to test with me, and they ended up doing it as like is infusing this substance. So I sat in the team doctor's office with this like IV in my arm, infusing this substance into my body, and that was turned out to be illegal. You can't just infuse or inject random things into your body. And I was, again, I sat in the doctor's office for hours, got put through that. Before I went down there, I did this this test, basically put me on a treadmill, ramp up the speed until I fall off the thing. And then we did it afterwards. And the improvement on that test was extremely significant with me. And I was, again, not world class, but certainly a national class runner. So
Mhm.
what they did is they said, "Hey, it worked for Steve. It's probably going to work for these Olympic runners." And
Mhm.
I was the guinea pig for before they potentially rolled it out for the athletes who actually mattered.
Now, you just said that it was illegal to put random things in your body. And um, maybe in the doping commission, it's illegal to put, we have these ideas of what's fair and what's not. And how they get decided is, from my layman's perspective, a little bit random. Uh, but there are these sort of like hard and fast lines of when you can and when you can't dope and whatnot. But I want to actually focus on putting random things in your body to improve performance, because I think we live in a world right now where putting random things in your body to improve performance based on spurious or no evidence or just like a good hunch is like the thing to do. What can you tell me about the rise of that like sort of self experimentation world that we live in right now?
I mean, I think we've hit like peak bro science, or maybe there's more bro science, but I think that's where we're at right now. Is it's interesting. Like I was a guinea pig for literally infusing a thing into my body, and now you're seeing people do that voluntarily. Now in sport, it's illegal because you can't, like, there's rules against infusing or injecting substances and amounts of substances. If you're just some dude on Instagram, there's no rules on it, right? And I think what's interesting is that there are potential consequences to this, not from a doping standpoint, but from a health standpoint and from an uncertainty, and that we don't know what most of this stuff does. And I think that that is underappreciated in kind of the bro science world, where we just kind of have these random experiments of like, hey, we're going to try this substance. Have you tried this peptide? Have you tried, this supplement, etc.? And there are no free lunches. And you see this often when you look at, hormone supplementation. So in, again, bro science world, you see a lot of testosterone use, again, illegal in sport, okay in real life, I guess, if you have a doctor's, prescription. But like when you take even, testosterone, like there is a consequence in your body. Your body will downregulate natural production of it. You see the same thing even to a higher degree in some of these longevity influencers taking things like thyroid stimulating hormone. When you take thyroid hormones, your body will shut off your thyroid production. And generally, you are on that thyroid hormone for life because it is really hard to like re-kick in that thyroid hormone. And we could go on and on with this, but I think what the point is, I think we often see it as like, oh, this is just experiment for health and longevity, and we're just trying to see what works. But there are no free lunches when it comes to the body. The body is infinitely more complex than we give it credit for. And when we downregulate one thing, we upregulate something else. And if we don't know what we're doing, if we're not looking at it systematically, we often get, years down the line and we're like, oh, crap. Like, I'm on this pill because I've fried my hormonal system of my body, and like, there's nothing I can do about it.
So the topic that I led with today, this is such a great segue. It was courage and what it takes to be courageous in the world. And I think that you blowing the whistle, I think whistleblowers in general, it takes a tremendous amount of courage. And when I think of courage, it has to do with facing a potential consequence for telling the truth, right? Facing something that's going to potentially hurt you emotionally, professionally, in a big picture. But there's a difference between courage and bravery. Bravery, in my mind, is when someone is the person who's testing thyroid medication on themselves for their own personal self benefit. It's a very brave thing to do. I don't know what's going to happen, but I hope that this will make me a better, whatever. Why I don't know why you're doing that, but you're to make you a better performance or whatever, or make me live longer. It's a very brave, potentially stupid thing to do, but courage is really different, right? Courage is saying that you're going out there and you're going to stand up for what's right versus just doing a stupid thing that might hurt you. And I would say that your career exemplifies courage. And and because you took an action which could have tanked your career, right? Going out talking about somebody who was professionally huge and going out there and saying that, no, you guys are doing something wrong. Tell me about what it took for you to take that step.
I think people underappreciate what it takes to get to that step. I think we kind of just see it as like, oh, it's right or wrong. The world is black or white. Am I a good person or am I bad? And that's too simple. Like life is super messy. And in my own situation, like I experienced that messiness, right? I rationalized and justified. I could have in that moment, right? When they were like, Steve, you're going to be a guinea pig. I could have stood up there and showed some courage and been like, no, I'm quitting this day. But I didn't. Why? Because life is messy. I rationalized and justified and said, well, they must know what they're doing. Like, this is a doctor. Like, we must be okay. And you know, I need this job. This is what pays my livelihood, my career. And what it finally took for me is I call it like this gnawing sensation where I knew what was like clear in my mind of right and wrong, of like this potentially violated rules and violated what I thought the spirit of the sport was, or what I thought, you know, the ethics of the sport was. And at first I kind of, you know, pushed that away. In fact, basically everyone around me, from my parents to my friends to, you know, even a very prominent, you know, judge in the legal system told me, you know, and I'll quote, he said essentially, um, whistleblowers never come on top. They might change things, but they always suffer in the long term. And I think he's right there. And that was from his experience. But that gnawing thought just wouldn't go away. And that is what pushed me over the top, because I said, you know what? I wish when I got in this job, someone had told me what I was entering. I wish that this was public knowledge so that, you know, I could make this decision on, do I want to like put myself in this situation or not? And after I left, I kept seeing athletes and individuals and coaches like get lured into the same spot of like, oh, this is a prestigious spot. You know, this is a great job. This is a great opportunity, without understanding what they were actually getting into. And to clear my conscience, I essentially came to the point where it's like, no, screw it. Like, people have to know, and they need that information. What they do with that information is up to them, but they deserve to know so that, you know, they can decide what's right and wrong for them.
You know, we live in a world now where we have we idolize the top people in the field, right? You know, I have hung out with a few top athletes, you know, and for instance, Laird Hamilton I was sort of close to him for years. Laird Hamilton is the big wave surfer who surfed, I guess, one of the biggest waves ever. And he's got this training facility, XPT, where a lot of buff dudes do things in the pool and in the ice and the sauna, and they look buff and awesome. And as an author, it's great to talk to know the top athletes. And in fact, your book, you talk about a lot of top athletes that you've worked with. And it's a compelling message for a reader to be like, oh, I can be like a top athlete. But on reflection, if I step back and I think about what it takes to be a top athlete, the way your whole life gets focused on being the top athlete, and you become this sort of sliver of a well-rounded human, because you have to, you know, choose time and money. Oh, you also need a lot of money to be a top athlete. It strikes me that even the desire to achieve peak performance is not what a reader actually needs or what a reader actually wants. And yet we want to emulate these people all the time. How do you square this? Because, you know, when you write, you're writing to a mainstream audience. And yet you also have to make these icons that become larger than life.
No, it's a great question. And here's what I think is that often what we see is we don't appreciate the other side, the downside of like making your essential entire identity around the pursuit. And you see this in the research, but not as much in the mainstream, is elite athletes really struggle once they've hit their often, late 20s, maybe early 30s, maybe late 30s if they're lucky, and their athletic ability, goes down and they have to retire and they have to do something else.
Mm-hmm.
There's a whole, section of psychology called like athlete identity crisis, where
Mm-hmm.
essentially, they struggle to transition on the other side because their entire life from often the age of, 12 has become pursuing this one thing. And they're not well-adjusted adults to be able to diversify that. And it's a major problem. And we don't give enough, credence or credit to that. You even see that with people like Michael Phelps, who talked about the depression and mental health that he struggled with. And I think when it comes to performance, what you have to do is use those examples. And this is my needle that I try to thread. Use those examples because the lay audience like looks up to them, latches onto them, and says, here it is.
Mm-hmm.
But then your job as a writer, I think, is to bring back a little of like nuance and reality in there.
Mm-hmm.
That's why in the book I say like, yeah, this is what, so and so did at the top. But there's also a little bit of downside to this, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's also hey, do I want my whole world to be around this? And you see this outside of sport too, the business world, right? What do we get told? Go all in, be obsessive, grind. All of those things might get you like a good achievement, but equally, they're just as likely to make you miserable while doing it.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, in the book, I talk about this a little bit. The freaking founder or father of capitalism, Adam Smith, warned us of this. He's the guy who essentially instituted striving for our modern world. And in his writings, he says like, yeah, striving is great. But if you solely focus on striving, it's going to backfire. He called it, you needed to balance it out with tranquility and contentment. And it's only when you have both of those that you're going to achieve something well, but you're also not going to be miserable doing it. And I think too often in this world, what happens was we just focus on the achievement and we forget about that tranquility and contentment or diversification of our sense of self. And I think for the vast majority of people, we're not trying to be the best in the world at one singular thing. We're trying to be pretty dang good at what we care about, but also to try and have a life that is like a good life and fulfilling and satisfying, and one where we can be content with family, friends, colleagues, others, instead of like being so single-minded. So it's almost like you have to lure people in with the stories of greatness and then like dose in there like, hey, don't forget about this stuff right here. And I would say, Scott, I think you see this too, is this is the problem with the optimization culture.
Mm-hmm.
Is we only hear about like the achievement optimize everything. And if we just are optimizing, either our physical fitness or our health or our longevity, we miss out on living our freaking life.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And like this is the thing that I loved about your opening chapter, is because the beginning is sort of about you being a whistleblower, and then about the nature of choking, not like eating food, but like, in a performance event, why you freeze up and why the you're not able to get your achievement. But then you go into this other section where you start talking about why, like, the antidote to choking is actually having a meaningful experience in life. Is that when we look inside, when we hyper optimize, when we scroll through freaking Instagram and we see the never ending sandpaper of abs that scrolls through your feed, you feel like you have to be that person, and like, that gold medalist, when they graduated gold medal school and they were like, oh shit, I don't know what I'm going to do with my life. They became a life coach because the only thing they know how to do is teach striving. And then what you say is like, look, the people who are choking, it's because they're not reaching outwards. They're not going out to actually see where they fit in a community, how they fit it amongst people, how they're not giving meaning to their lives because they're so solipsistically focused. So I don't know. How do we break that cycle, Steve?
Yeah, it's really hard. And I think its key is like accepting that it's really hard because the modern world is engineered against us breaking that cycle. In briefly, think about it this way, is way back in the day when, I don't know, we're on the savannah in our tribe, it was relatively easy to contribute and feel significant because among a couple dozen people, you know, you're going to find out, can I hunt pretty well? Can I be a cook, a caretaker? Like, you could contribute. Okay. It was also, you had a community and you belonged to, to that group in that community. Now our comparison is so large that it's not just me and a couple dozen people I'm comparing against. It's the whole freaking world. As you said, you go on Instagram and you see near perfection everywhere, and that is your comparison point. The human brain was not meant for that. We search for status and significance, but in a global world where it's nearly impossible to achieve that, what happens is that just makes us feel miserable and into this like choking underperformance world. So what do we have to do? How do we bounce back against that? Is we have to actively work to like diversify our sense of self, diversify our sources of meaning. And I think there's like some elite performers that actually do this well, and research that shows us this. So one of my favorite studies I came across is that Nobel Prize winning scientists were more likely to have hobbies and interests that they pursued than those who were a rung or two below. And this goes against our like be single-minded, be all in, be focused, mindset. And the reason I think it does is because this idea in psychology that is called self-complexity, which shows that if we see ourselves through a more complex lens, meaning we have more roles, meaning it's not just I'm Steve, the writer or the runner, but I'm also, a husband, a father, someone who likes, to cook or read books or do interesting things. Like when we have more complexity around ourselves, we are actually more resilient. Because if my writing, for whatever reason, doesn't go well that day, guess what? I'm still going to enjoy playing with, my daughters, or I'm still going to show up and be a good husband, or I'm still going to go out and get my run or my exercise in. There are other things in my life that provide other avenues for significance and meaning. And I think in our world, we've kind of narrowed too far. And what we have to do is diversify and get out to broad exploration. Not much different than what you probably do as a writer is when you start a project, you don't say, okay, I'm going to narrow in only on this thing. You go broad first, right? You try and look at a broad list of like books that reach out and interviews because you don't know quite where you're going. And I think in life we narrow too quickly, and instead we kind of need to be a little bit more like a writer, which is like breadth before narrowing.
All right, before we go on, I just want to give you a heartfelt thank you for just listening and engaging with these ideas and this content here on my channel. And I'd like to ask a couple things of you, and I'm just going to squeeze it all in real quickly here, and then we'll get right back into the interview. Hit that like and subscribe button. Let the algorithm do its thing so that people can keep on finding this stuff. That it's stupid that that's the way the world works, but that is the way that the world works. I also want to just give you a heads up. I have a back channel where I do sort of more opinionated pieces, more freeform pieces, and maybe check it out. I get a little bit more spicy over there. And anyway, there's a link in the description and like on my homepage. It's called Scott Carney's Back Channel, Interesting Things. And lastly, most importantly, the people who really make this reporting possible and fund my investigations, these are the people who are on Substack. And I'd love you to go check it out. Get my newsletter in your inbox a little bit earlier than you get them here on YouTube. And honestly, I'm going up against grifters all the time. They are threatening to sue me like all the time. I managed to get the CEO of AG1 fired, and they hired a $1 billion lawyer, the lawyer who took down Fox News, to take me off the air. Now, I managed to weather that. $44 million of subscriptions were canceled from AG1, and I made about $4,000 or $5,000 on YouTube for doing that. This is not a profitable game, and if you want this sort of work to exist when the media is collapsing, well, please subscribe. Please be a patron of journalism. And without further ado, back to the interview. When I'm scrolling through, say, Instagram or whatever, and I see a person who I'm like, oh, that person's lifestyle looks cool. And they're usually selling, something. And they usually have a group of friends around them. Like a lot of the statements by say, let's talk about Joe Rogan, for instance. Joe Rogan, it's like you're sitting with him and like you're having a conversation with a couple bros, and it's just fun. It feels friendly and nice. And then in the sort of like the health space, it's a bunch of bros working out really badass in the gym and getting swole and getting, super focused. And it's this collection of essentially elites. And there's the fantasy that you are going to become an elite too. And we're courting these elite spaces in our brains as if they're friends, because this whole parasocial thing works really well on the internet. But one of the things that I think that you're saying is that with hobbies, it's not about trying to join a tribe of other elites. It's about joining a tribe of everyone. Like, have you dropped cookies off at your new neighbor's house when they showed up? Do you know your neighbors? Can you play a board game with an elite athlete? Much more interesting than can you keep up with them in the workout. And there's this sense of like almost loneliness that we have in the world no, sorry, not like a sense. There is an overriding amount of loneliness and an incapability of making friends.
I think you're spot on, and that's why I'm going to interject, because I think this is the essence of why we feel like we're just surviving in life.
Mm-hmm.
Because we know that belonging is a fundamental human psychological need. And for good reason, because again, going back to the savannah, if you were out on your hunt or gathering with friends, you could feel safe and secure to a degree. If you were alone, you were probably screwed and gonna die, because if like that lion or tiger or snake came upon you, like you were done for. So we developed this sense of community and connection and belonging. And I think what we've done in the modern world is we substituted the deep connection, the like real world connection, with this like superficial candy version, right? We're instead of eating our vegetables, we're reaching for like the pure sugar snack that's like, oh, this will satiate us, and it never does. And we're almost fooled into it, because the podcast example is a great one, or the YouTube example of where we're watching, a bunch of bros have a conversation. It fools us into thinking like, oh, we're there. These are our people. This is us. Like, we're at the campfire having the talk with them, but we're not, right? We're just not. So it fools us into having this almost like we're fitting in. And what we really need is belonging. And you can see this in the data, right? Whether we look at loneliness, whether we look at the percent of people who, know and interact with their neighbors on their street or in their community, whether we look at the data on, again, local communities or local hobbies. Decades ago, Putnam wrote, Bowling Alone, essentially, and was getting at that, like, we don't have bowling leagues and things that people connect at. It's even more true 25 years ago, or 25 years later, where we don't have these things to connect us on a, real human level. And what research tells us is, if you look at the psychology research, is that there's something to being together in person, looking at each other's eyes, and having a conversation that both psychologically, and if we look at hormonally in terms of releases of things like oxytocin and other hormones that push us towards this belonging, that does not occur when we get this like superficial or online or whatever fitting in. So my advice to people is like, figure out how to do real things in the real world with real people. Like, that is, it sounds simple, but it's the antidote. And the last thing I'll leave for you is there's actually evidence of this in the dating world. If you look at research, it shows that if you go on dates and do interesting things where you are active participant in the thing, right? Maybe you go play a board game with each other, or like go to one of those, solve a puzzle places, right? If you do that, you will feel more connected to that person that you're on a date with, more likely to go on a second date with, and more likely to disclose like actual real things and being authentic to that person to create that belonging. If you don't, if you just go on a date where you're, let's say, a passive participant, you go to the movies and sit there, that doesn't happen. And you don't get that, second date as much. You don't get that feeling of connection and belonging. Expand that out to the real world, right? We are passive consumers of just about everything. And we need to get to a place where we're active and creating real connection in the world.
Super easy to turn on a podcast and listen to some people talk, and it actually takes courage to go out and try to meet somebody where you don't know how it's going to go. You have a chance of being rejected. You have a chance of success, and we are generally, as a society, cowards because we don't want to go out and risk the most mundane thing that we have done for evolutionarily all the way back, which is talking to your neighbors, hanging out with people, being bored with folks, and just trying to figure out what you're going to do next in a group. And it's funny. I don't have a ton. I'm a perfect example of not having a ton of male friends, and I realize that it's an issue. Still, I do go out. I have probably 5 people who I'm like, yeah, this is cool. But I am actually personally looking for like, oh, well, I have been sucked into the internet. I have been sucked into the YouTubes and things, and getting out there. Even though I personally do make an effort, I still want to make more. I still want to go out and do things.
Well,
Have you figured it out?
yeah, I haven't figured it out either. But I think this is like it's normal that we haven't, because we have everything in society pushing us against us, right? And what we have to do is we need to like just edge back. So maybe we don't go completely the other day, but we have these small moments where we can have some sense of connection and belonging, even if it's with a small group of people. But I think what you get at there is one of the key constructs that we wrestle with, which is we have an antidote to every negative feeling, right? So those negative feelings, or the things we think are negative, boredom. If you look at the boredom, what it is designed to do is essentially get us to go out and explore. And if you have young kids, you know this, right? If your young kid gets bored, that's often when they start creating games for themselves. You probably remember this as a kid, right? You're bored, you go talk to mom and dad, and like instead of giving you a device, they're like, well, go play with the ball. And you just go create a new game out of it. And that's what research tells us, is that boredom is often the first step in creativity. If we look at the feeling of loneliness, it is often the feeling that is supposed to nudge us towards connection, right? We feel a little bit lonely. What are we supposed to do? It's supposed to nudge us towards going to talk to our spouse, our significant other, our neighbors, going over and having a chat or a connection. But instead, what we have is we have all these like superficial things that will like deal with the feeling. Instead of feeling bored and getting creative, we feel bored and we pull out our phone and start scrolling. Instead of we feel lonely, what do? We put on a podcast or watch the YouTube video of other people, right? Or maybe we go on Twitter and join in on our tribe of random people who we don't actually know, but we start slinging mud and doing crazy things because that's what it's all about. And that makes us temporarily feel a little bit better because we're like, oh, I defended my tribe, even though that tribe is completely made up and artificial. So I think what we have to do is we have to realize that instead of taking the synthetic antidote to some of these feelings, we have to look at, okay, what are they actually signaling? And how do we like fulfill these with like actually nourishing things?
In a related way, I have noticed, and I've written and talked about this quite frequently, that we have this rise of like sort of scientization in the podcast world, in the book world. I've written, I guess, 3 books largely on human psychology and health. And I always have a chapter about your prefrontal cortex and your amygdala and the way you drop adrenaline and cortisol in various situations. And we scientize it. And it's sort of like similar to what you're saying. You feel weird in your body and you go out and you look for solutions on the internet that give you what are those dopamine hits or whatever. But I feel that there is a problem with the scientization of things in general. Is that one, when I was in college, this was like more than 20 years ago, we looked at neuroscience as like that. Those are really smart people who have no idea what they're talking about. and you can talk about what's going on in the brain, you can talk about the parts, but you don't really know how it pushes over into consciousness, actually really pushes over to how you're feeling. And I feel like there's this issue, like even with performance, if we talk about how someone's running better or working better, there's a side of that where you can talk about how you uptake glucose and how your muscles do this stuff and blah blah blah. There's a mechanical explanation which is very popular in sort of the Hubermans and the Atiyahs and the Gogginses of the world. On the other hand, there's this psychological part which is also really important, and maybe, just maybe, you and I have contributed to this problem by considering the science too much. Like, how much do we actually need to know what our prefrontal cortex is doing right now? Why do we care about our amygdala?
I agree. I think we have contributed, and I think for good reason. And there was actually a study on this that showed that like when you use fancy neuroscience terms, people tend to believe it more, even if those terms are made up, right? Because it's almost like our brain goes like, oh, that's fancy. That's science. That must be true. Let's do it. But if we step back, and I'm a science nerd, right? My background, my master's is in exercise physiology. I started a PhD in it until I realized that this sucks. I don't want to do this. But like, that's where my brain is. I can talk it all day. But consider this. You mentioned Atiyah and Huberman when they talk about, performance. Let's look at my field, exercise. If I was, and this is going to come across as harsh, but it's true. If I was to follow Atiyah or Huberman's protocols based on the science for performance, health, longevity, especially in the endurance world, I would not be as good as if I went to my high school cross-country coach and listened to them. And that high school cross-country coach doesn't know probably all the science and the mitochondria and the VO2 max and stuff, but they are going to be able to train me better for that health, longevity, endurance, performance. Why? Because like they have the experience and knowledge of testing ideas in the real world and saying, when I do X, Y, and Z, does this translate to better mile performance or not? Does this help these athletes improve or not? And they get to adjust and see it. When you don't have that, or you just have like the science, you're behind. And this is actually why, again, if I put on my coaching hat, is we have this saying in the endurance coaching world where it's the science generally explains what we already do. And if we only followed the science best practices, we'd probably be about 20 to 30 years behind what we're actually doing, training or coaching athletes, whether at a high school, college, or even elite level. And I often think about this, okay, if that's true in my field that I know really well of exercise, it's probably true elsewhere in the fields that I don't know. In neuroscience, even though I myself am drawn to, amygdala this and prefrontal cortex this, it's probably true that the people on the front line, like dealing with the actual problem and not sciencing the crap out of it, probably have a better idea of how to help people with the things that they're going through. And I think this is, again, one of the problems. And the last thing I'll say on this is I experienced this on social media, right? I'll tweet something out based on my years of coaching. I spent 20 years helping elite runners or college runners or high school runners, basically at every level I've coached, get better. And I'll say, hey, based on my experience, do these workouts. And someone, probably with good intentions will be like, where's the peer reviewed study on that? And in my head, I'm like, dude, like I've coached hundreds of athletes. Like I've seen this. And like, it's not just me. We have a history of other coaches where we've seen that, doing this thing probably helps. But we have this idea in our head where we need some sort of scienciness to say, oh, I now feel validated. Now I can do that. And I think that often that gets in the way of actually helping us, whether it's perform or live better.
100%. I am sick of science being misused. And, you said it well when you said, look, the science is best when it explains what we're already been doing. We've already seen results, and then it explains the mechanism, as in it's backward looking versus forward looking. Like 7 mice in Israel did better on this treadmill taking L-creatine or something. Therefore you should do it. It sends you down these like ridiculous paths, assuming that just because there's a good looking paper out there, it fetishizes it, and it misses the point, especially when we don't all want to be. I think the game, maybe that book Moneyball screwed us all over, right? When it was Moneyball, the idea that you hyper optimize different. I can't even explain Moneyball, like, because I'm not really a sports guy, but it's the idea that you statistically looked at players and you found the statistical best actions to win. Maybe you can describe Moneyball better than me. All right, I want to switch out.
Well, no, let me comment on that, because I think you're spot. Okay, so Moneyball is like, yeah, it did some good things, but it's essentially like optimization on steroids. Like look for the statistical anomaly which we can take advantage of. And I think, again, there's some good stuff in there, but I think like most ideas, we tend to go too far in one direction. And I would say that when we look at the optimization of everything and the examples that exist in the real world, most of them are bullshit. And I'll give the one that comes to mind is, the Team Sky cycling, where they, for years, you looked at, okay, they got the best pillows, and then like optimized the distance they walked from the team bus to the bike so that they didn't tire out. It was like the theory that they pushed publicly was marginal gains, everything matters, we need to do this. But then once the layers got pulled back, you realize that no, they were probably just doing some shady stuff that allowed them to compete at that level. Again, there's all sorts of evidence now, but like it was the shady stuff, the taking of substances that may have been illegal and all of that probably made the difference. It wasn't that they got the exact like right fluffy pillow for the person to sleep on. And that's generally what you see in these optimization of everything cultures, because I've been on the other side of elite sport and seen that. And it's mostly a facade. It was a facade at Nike. Everybody thought, oh, we're optimizing everything. And I'm sitting there being like, no, we're not. It's not how it's portrayed. But the reason is this, is if we truly tried to optimize everything, we would be miserable. You would create someone who is a perfectionist, who is neurotic around things. And what, again, tons of research tells us is that if we move all the way towards that perfectionism, neuroticism, going back to the beginning, it makes us more susceptible to choking. Why? Because if one little thing is off, our brain goes like, holy crap, my shoes aren't tied correctly, or I didn't have the exact ratio of carbs and protein for breakfast, I'm screwed, because we've trained our brain to think we need to be perfect to perform. And more often, what you have to do is realize that it's never going to be perfect, and you still have to have to figure out how to show up anyways, because that is life.
And this is also the way the griftoverse works, right? When we start, if we just did a very simple concept, and you wrote a book called Do Hard Things, and to sum it up in a very dumb way, you do hard things that encourages growth, encourages range and ability, and that's cool. It's a pretty old message. It's been around for a long time. The Greeks had a word for it. It was called hormesis. The Spartans did ice baths and did hard stuff, and then they got like badass, and they eventually had a movie made about them. The Doing hard things is important. It's good. It's tried and true. It's growth. We can even scienceify it with talking about various biological mechanisms. But doing hard things on its own doesn't make you any money. It makes you a lot more money. Be like doing hard things in a very specific way, either with a protocol or a genetic test or a great pillow or a blah blah blah. Go on and on and on, and then you have monetization. And Steve, I'm going to give you a compliment here. You don't sell supplements. I don't think. You
do
better
not.
not sell supplements, right? You don't have a pillow. You don't have an optimized shoe. And it's because you inherently are not primarily motivated by money. I'm sure you need money, right? But you're not primarily motivated by money. And that's also not my primary motivation. But it is incredibly toxic in this optimization space in America in general, in the what I call the griftoverse, to find a very normal thing, do some hard things, and then mix it with something that you can sell. Why didn't you go grifty?
Because that is not in my ethics or morals or who I am as a person. I've seen the downfall of chasing what I'd call the external. That external could be fame, it could be money and financial success. And I think if that's your primary motivator, you might achieve those goals, you might be rich beyond means, but generally you're left always still chasing. You're never satisfied. You are never, to go back to the beginning, you never have any sort of contentment in your world. And that's not a path I wanted to go down. I mean, I could easily. I mean, again, I have enough cachet in writing and running to say, hey, if you want to run a 4-minute mile, like take this special supplement and it'll get you there too. And then show a video of me running fast on the track. But and that would probably sell and I'd make a lot of money. But that's not authentic and that's not me. And that would make me, again, like a shallow caricature of who I am. I get why people go down that path, but I think, again, what it does to me is it takes away any sort of sense of credibility that we have. Like whenever I see someone who is shilling supplements that they sell or some sort of solution to something that, again, we isn't that complex, right? That we could do by going down to the local Walmart and get the same thing. That just signals like, oh man, you're in on the grift. Like you're selling the thing. And the other thing that I often see in the griftoverse, as you coined it there, is there's often this creation of either fear or us versus them. And that's also why I think it's really dangerous going down that path, because in order for you to sell the thing, you have to build yourself up and often put other people down or create an enemy out there. And what a miserable way to live an existence if you're like doing that all the time. I think I would be miserable doing it. So that's why I'm not.
So, Steve, let's talk about the Nazis. The Nazi Germany, starting in about 1936, but actually also before, was the home of health fads. They loved kettlebells. They kettlebell juggled. They took ice baths. They took saunas. They were vegetarians. They were anti-processed foods. They had a national task force on cancer that actually cited smoking as one of the worst things that you could do. They also loved eugenics. Goering, I know it was either Himmler or Goering, sent an expedition to Tibet to look for lost knowledge from the continent of Lemuria. Do you see any parallels between Nazi Germany and their health fads and the rise of the MAHA movement in the United States?
Oh man, that's a loaded question. But I think there are similarities in the sense that generally what happens is when there's lots of chaos in the world, when we create an us versus them, when we are searching for that like external instead of like the internal, we go down these paths, right? That could be looking for the magic elixir or the thing that works, or it could be like fusing your identity with the thing. And there's some fascinating research that comes out that essentially shows that a couple things is one, if you look at the rise of conspiracy theories, one of the biggest contributors to that is loneliness, and people end up fusing their identity to the conspiracy theory so that they feel like they have a group. There's, again, other research that shows that identity fusion to a movement or a charismatic person in that movement happens when we feel alone, uncertain, not sure where we're going to find our significance, etc. And I think I think what we see is individuals, often people grifting, take advantage of that from people and create this path towards, if you do these protocols, if you join us to fight them, then we're almost giving you that superficial sense of connection and direction that makes you feel okay for a little bit. And that's how they create that group. And what I would say on this is to step back from Nazis for a minute. If we wanted to actually make America healthy, which I'm 100% for, I care about health. I exercise. I try and eat pretty well, etc. Like, most of the biggest bang for our buck would be doing simple things, right? Like making sure people have like clean water to drink, making sure people have access to real foods and real things, allowing people, the time and energy to create that connection and belonging in the real world. It would being creating cities that have bike paths and running paths and walkable places so that we can increase movement. It would be things like decreasing, smoking. And often what happens is sometimes those things are talked about a little bit, but instead what gets discussed are these like very specific, like microcosms of idea where we say, oh, nope, it is this thing. We're going to focus on this thing. And I think that's intentional because it's easier to convince people that, we're going to go on a crusade against seed oils. And if you don't think, if we just fix seed oils, it will fix everything else, than it is to convince people, hey, we need to allow people to go on walks. We need to get children out of poverty because the biggest predictor of health is like your zip code and where you live. We need to maybe give, expand free lunches for kids in elementary school and expand recess or PE access for those kids as well so they can eat well and exercise as well. Those programs aren't talked about. Instead, it's like these very specific things where people can make money off of them. And I think that all contributes to this problem or movement that we found ourselves in.
Well, I think that when I see the rise of MAHA, and you wanted to step back from the Nazis, but I'm just step right back into them. When I see the rise of MAHA, I see nothing but the people who I've been doing videos about grifting with criminal records, doing scams. I see them getting their photos taken with RFK Jr. I don't see the people who've been calling out the scams. I don't see the people who are actual scientific authorities. I see tweet wars and I see us versus them thinking. And I don't think that there was that I wonder when the Make America Healthy Again, I'm wondering where that again actually is pointing to. And yeah, I've just been fascinated by just seeing the number of grifters who I've been calling out for decades, just right there with RFK Jr. And I have bad hopes. I had a little bit of hope at first because I like some of the talking points, but I have very little hope when I see what's actually occurring.
I'm with you, and it scares the shit out of me, honestly, um, because like health matters, and we need to support health. And no, are we perfect? Absolutely not. Right? There's a lot of things that we could do better, but I just wish we were focusing on those big bucket items. Instead, I think what you see is a desire to make a name for yourself, to get your grift going. Because if you look at the people who are right there next to RFK Jr., they're often selling their own supplement line, have some sort of program that allows them to get financial success from whatever they're pitching, and it's not genuine, you know. And I think what we need is the people who maybe aren't motivated financially, but like genuinely care about the health of our society, like, and have the expertise to do something about it. And we're not elevating those people because it sells a lot more to go us versus them, to fear monger, to create this strange world where it's like, you get on this bandwagon or you're against us. And it's easier to sell that online, and it's easier to like go viral online. You don't go viral telling people like, hey, we need to get clean water in these places, or we need to allow people to sleep more, or we need to again, fix poverty for some reason because it's one of the biggest indicators of health. You don't go viral doing that. You go viral saying some esoteric thing where it's like, this is the evil of all evils. Can you believe this? Fear monger. And that takes off.
100%. And I want to ask you another question, which always riles around my mind. So I've written 3 books on health, essentially, and I've come from an anthropological background. Like you, I dropped out at the PhD. I was like, I'm going to forget this. I'm going to write popular. And what I have seen, one of the concepts that I write about is something I call the wedge, which is where you put yourself in a stressful situation. Like, let's talk about an ice bath. You put yourself in an ice bath, and the ice bath is like the sensation of death, and it triggers autonomic responses. And then in the ice bath, you say to yourself, all right, I'm going to chill out. I'm going to relax in this ice bath. And there's going to be all these downstream effects, literal mind over matter, not levitating, but just like I'm in the sensation of death and I can relax, which has a variety of health benefits that I, write about so much in my books, and yet aren't perfectly scientifically backed up, right? The science around it is at best B+ around ice baths. And the science that gets promoted all often is not about the psychology of that moment. The science that gets promoted says ice baths trigger BAT production. Ice baths create resilience sort of mechanistically. And I feel like we've missed an opportunity as a culture to talk about the actual mind-body connection. What happens when you change your brain? When we talk about your amygdala, let's go back to the amygdala, and you actually exercise a thought to change your physiology, and why that is considered unscientific, and yet proposing a mechanism without evidence is considered scientific. How do we resolve this?
I'm 100% with you. It's because we're obsessed with, we think if there is something that we can measure, it is objective and that makes it better. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't. It just means that we don't have the ability to measure these things that are going on because like the technology isn't there yet in most cases. And that's okay. That doesn't mean it's less significant. And I think the ice bath example is perfect because, you and I have both written about it, you for much longer before, but like the genesis of the ice bath or the purpose of it is essentially like do something hard, right? Mm-hmm. That makes you feel kind of alive. And you have to force yourself to deal with it. It's not all the mumbo jumbo that is often put out there to convince people. And I wish we just like said that, but it doesn't have these cool data and figures behind it. So therefore, like, people don't promote it in that way. And I don't know how we deal with or reconcile that, but it's fundamental to, like, one of the problems we have. And I'll go away from science to answer this a little bit, because it's one of my favorite quotes I've seen, is the mythologist Joseph Campbell, who is famous for, influenced George Lucas and Star Wars and all of that good stuff. Great.
He's behind me somewhere here. I don't know
Yeah,
where, but yes.
he's there. His writing is great. His work is great. And in one of his interviews, he talked about essentially the meaning of life, or what he thought mattered a whole lot.
People say that what we're all seeking is a meaning for life. I don't think that's what we're really seeking. I think what we're seeking is an experience of being alive.
We need peak experiences that make us feel alive. And that's nebulous, right? What does that even mean? We can't measure that. But I think as we enter a world that is internet of everything, online of everything, social media of everything, all of that numbs us. And it reminds me of Campbell saying, we need to do things that make us feel alive. What makes us feel alive? Do an ice bath, right? Doing a hard run or bike ride, going on a date, doing novel and interesting things in the real world, challenging ourselves, writing a book that we're not sure we can finish, like creating art. All of those things have some sort of effect where we feel this sensation that we can't quantify, but we know that we had to wrestle with that moment and, like, find our way through it. And what I found most interesting about Campbell is, I think it was Bill Moyers asked him as a follow-up question. He said, well, tell me about some of your experiences where you felt alive. And Campbell takes him back to when he was in college, running the 800-meter race on the track. And he was describing is like, you get all this pain and sensation, but you still want to catch that competitor ahead of you. And he's saying, that's what made me feel alive. And we can't quantify that. We can quantify what's going in our body during that moment. And we can talk about mechanisms, but that feeling of sensation, we can't. And I think when we go too much towards the scienciness and the mechanisms of X, Y, and Z, we miss out on just this fundamental human nature that, like, if we do things that challenge us, we're going to tend to feel better. And I think we need to do a better job of being honest about that. And again, I think the last point I'll say on this is, it's hard to sell that, Scott. It's easier to sell this. It's easier to sell, go do this magic workout because it increases, BDNF by 50%, or go jump in the ice bath because it activates, this such and such pathway. It's harder to sell, hey, go sprint up a hill, because at the end you're going to be breathing hard and you're going to feel a sensation that you haven't felt in a while, and that is good for you.
It's fascinating because I'm so glad you brought up Campbell and you brought up that quote, which I had not heard before, because it strikes me that it is actually possible to scientifically study this. It's just not studied. Like, there is obviously this links in with placebo research, links in with the adherence effect. There's a lab in Ireland called the Cochrane Institute that does look at active placebos. An active placebo is like something that gives you a sensation that then you can click on and you feel, and therefore maybe it gives you a health benefit, which is why you see caffeine in a lot of supplements. It's why you see B vitamins in a lot of supplements, which might give you flushing, because that sensation helps trigger a placebo response because you're feeling something, and then maybe you can have an outcome. It's interesting because you could study different placebos and say, hey, these are placebos. We don't know that the mechanism we're looking, the thing that we're looking at is sensation. And we're not going to compare side by side different placebos for different health outcomes. There are some ethical problems. Like if you were studying syphilis and you just gave people a shaman and ayahuasca, they're still going to die of syphilis. We tried something like that once. It didn't go well. It was in Tuskegee. But to say that they couldn't be studied is not true. because you can study a lot of things scientifically. It's that they're not studied. And then the moniker of science, the moniker of credibility is not able to be put on these questions. And this is actually where some of that wellness world that I'm very, very critical of, all that grift, actually has something to it. And trying to figure out how to navigate this world, because I'm very common. I just say that person's a scammer, right? That person over there, Joe Dispenza, who is a freaking scammer, right, is really good at creating a great active placebo. So how do we like cut out the active part? It's probably, actually, you probably already answered this. It's probably the money. Are they making a lot of money? It's probably bullshit.
Yeah, that's a great point, and I think thanks for clarifying that. Is some of this stuff can be studied. I just think that all the incentives are aligned against it, because what is the incentive in science is often to look at mechanisms, right, and go down this rabbit hole of like test this in mice and see if it activates this pathway. Going back in grad school, I remember my advisor once said, you have to remember, there are a billion pathways. And basically anything we do will activate some sort of pathway. Mm-hmm. And that might sound good, but what actually matters is the functional result. Mm-hmm. Like, did this make me better at X, Y, and Z? And we often forget that. And I think that's what we're getting at on this, if we spent more time studying, these things on feelings and how it translates. And I would say this is like coaching 101. Right? Mm-hmm. What do I do when an athlete is nervous before a big race or big performance? Do you sit there and like give them some sort of like, scientific blah, blah, blah? No, you put on your best game face and you like try to convince them, often through like a hype speech or whatever, that like they're ready to go. Even if deep down, like maybe you don't quite believe it, you have to put on that game face and do that essentially placebo. And often, again, if you talk to coaches, it will shift what they're feeling and experiencing and allow them to perform at a higher level. So like again, some of this stuff could be studied. And again, it's hard to disseminate or distinguish between like, I don't know, Tony Robbins telling you the greatest ever and like interventions that might actually be ethical and work to a degree. But I think because it's in this nebulous world, we often just kind of like throw it to the side. And instead, like we need to study and research and give some, credit towards it.
All right. So Coach Steve, I have a question for you. I'm going to request an Agincourt speech from you.
Of fighting men, they have full 70,000.
That's 5-1. Besides, they are all fresh.
We are down. Our team is down right now. The pro science team is down.
It is a fearful odds.
We're at the wrong end of the field, and we're looking up against a group of grifters who have taken over the information space, Steve. I'm feeling low here. Coach Steve, tell me how we're going to win this.
You're putting me on the spot here, but here's what I'll say is there's always hope. We can never give up hope. It might seem like the odds are against us. It might seem like, we're in the fourth quarter and the time is running out and we can't get there. But we have the players on our team. We have smart people. We're on the same team here, Scott. There's more of us. We need to do a better job of working together, of figuring out what steps we can take and doing the things that we can control to make progress in this spot. It might seem hopeless, but that's what they want us to feel. If we feel hopeless, we give up. If we have some hope, if we realize that even the smallest bit of progress is impacting people positively, taking them away from the grift and taking them towards a path that helps them actually live better, that is what it's all about. We're not trying to be billionaires making the grift. We're trying to actually help people, Scott. So let's focus on that.
Let's go. All right. Everyone, thank you so much for listening to this show. I want you to go out and go meet a neighbor. I want you to go make friends. I want you to dump all of your supplements down the drain because they're not helping you. And I want you to go out and take a look at Steve Magness's social media profiles. I follow him on Twitter. I think I also see you on Threads. And he's got a new book out. You should probably go read it or listen to it. And he will give you a motivational speech that gets you out of there, that gets you to go give a hug to someone you almost know that you will know soon, because we are all on the same team. We are on the team of reality. And I just want to thank you so much for having this conversation with me today, Steve.
Thanks so much, Scott. You're the best. Keep doing what you're doing.
Thank you so much to all of my supporters on Patreon and on Substack who make this work possible. If you want early access and to get your name on the honor roll, please check out those links down below. And, it just means the world to me that you're here. From Poke Bear LLC in Denver, Colorado, this was Scott Carney Investigates.